The autumn rain drummed against the windows of St. Mary's Hospital, like 1,000 tiny fingers tapping out Morse code messages no one could decipher. Sarah Mitchell stood in the dimly lit corridor of Ward 7, her white shoes silent against the polished floor that reflected the fluorescent lights like pools of mercury. At 42, she had perfected the art of moving through grief like a ghost through walls, present but untouchable. The night shift always belonged to her. It was easier this way, she told herself. Easier to face the dying when the world outside was already dressed in darkness. Her fingers absently traced the small Celtic cross pendant hidden beneath her scrubs, a habit she'd developed since her father's death 30 years ago, a death she'd been too young to understand, too powerless to prevent. Room 314 beckoned with its soft, amber glow. Inside, Thomas Whitmore lay propped against stark white pillows, his weathered hands folded across his chest like a man already practicing for his coffin. 78 years had carved deep lines into his face, each wrinkle a story he'd never tell. The cancer had taken his strength but not his stubbornness, that Yorkshire grit that made him refuse pain medication until the very last moment. "Not sleeping again, Mr. Whitmore?" Sarah's voice carried the practiced warmth of someone who'd learned to care without breaking. She entered with a tray of medications, noting how his hand immediately moved to his jacket hanging on the nearby chair. Checking, always checking that pocket. "Sleep's for those with clear consciences, love," Thomas replied, his accent thick with the north, words rasping like sandpaper against wood. His eyes, still sharp despite the morphine, followed her movements with the intensity of a man counting down his remaining breaths. Sarah adjusted his IV drip, her movements precise, clinical, yet somehow tender. "We all have our ghosts, Mr. Whitmore. Sometimes they're loudest in the quiet hours." He studied her then, really looked at her for the first time since his admission 2 weeks prior. "You speak like someone who knows about ghosts, Nurse Mitchell." "Sarah," she corrected gently, checking his vitals on the monitor. "And yes, I suppose I do. Lost my dad when I was 12. Never got to say goodbye properly. Sometimes I wonder if that's why I ended up here, helping others say their goodbyes." Thomas's hand drifted again to his jacket. Sarah pretended not to notice, but she'd observed this ritual dozens of times. Whatever he kept in that pocket seemed heavier than any weight a dying man should carry. "My boy, Daniel," Thomas suddenly said, the name escaping like steam from a kettle too long on the boil. "Haven't spoken in 20 years. 20 bloody years over money, can you believe it? His mother's inheritance. I thought I was protecting him, but I was just a proud fool." The rain intensified outside, and Sarah pulled a chair closer to his bed. In 15 years of palliative care, she'd learned that sometimes the greatest medicine was simply being present for someone's confession. 20 years is a long time, she acknowledged, watching his fingers unconsciously tap against his chest where the jacket pocket would be. "Aye, and every day of it written down," Thomas whispered, his eyes growing distant. "Every birthday missed, every Christmas alone, every time I picked up the phone and couldn't dial, all of it in there." He nodded toward the jacket. "But what good are words when the bridge is already burned?" Sarah felt something shift in her chest, a recognition of kindred pain. "Sometimes bridges can be rebuilt, Mr. Whitmore. Sometimes all it takes is one person brave enough to lay the first plank." Thomas laughed, but it turned into a cough that shook his entire frame. Sarah was quick with the oxygen mask, her hands steady even as her heart raced. When he finally settled, his eyes were wet with more than just the strain of coughing. "Brave," he repeated, tasting the word like foreign food. "I was brave once. Built houses with these hands, raised a son, loved a woman until cancer took her too, but I can't seem to find that courage now when I need it most." The monitor beeped softly, marking time like a metronome for a song no one wanted to hear ending. Sarah stood to leave, but Thomas's weathered hand caught hers. His grip was surprisingly strong, desperate. "Promise me something, Sarah," he said urgently. "When I'm gone, and we both know it won't be long, promise me you'll look in that pocket. Promise me someone will know what I couldn't say." Sarah's breath caught. In all her years, no patient had ever asked this of her. She squeezed his hand gently, feeling the weight of unspoken words already settling on her shoulders. 3 days passed in the rhythm of hospital routine, medication rounds, shift changes, the quiet ballet of life and death that played out in Ward 7. Sarah found herself drawn repeatedly to room 314, telling herself it was professional concern, knowing it was something deeper. Thomas had grown weaker, his breathing more labored, but his hand never strayed far from that jacket pocket. On Thursday evening, Daniel Whitmore's name appeared in Thomas's medical file as next of kin, with a London address and a phone number that Sarah knew had never been dialed from the hospital. She stared at the information during her break, sipping lukewarm coffee in the staff room, while rain continued its endless percussion against the windows. "You're getting too involved again," Margaret warned. The senior nurse had worked alongside Sarah for a decade and recognized the signs. "I see how you look at him. He reminds you of someone, doesn't he?" Sarah's hand went unconsciously to her pendant. "My father was nothing like Mr. Whitmore. Dad was gentle, soft-spoken. He died before we could become strangers to each other. Sometimes that's worse," Margaret said quietly. "The what-ifs can be heavier than the what was." That night, Sarah found Thomas struggling to write, his hands shaking so violently that the pen kept slipping from his grasp. Pages of crumpled paper surrounded his bed like fallen leaves. "Let me help," Sarah offered, pulling up her chair. "What are you trying to write?" Thomas's pride wrestled with his desperation, before desperation won. "The letter in my pocket," he admitted, voice barely above a whisper. "I've been rewriting it for 20 years. Every version felt wrong. Too much excuse, not enough truth. Too much truth, not enough love. How do you tell your son that you were wrong? How do you explain that grief made you cruel?" Sarah took the pen gently from his trembling fingers. "Maybe you just start with 'I'm sorry' and let the rest follow." "I need him to know about his mother," Thomas continued, tears flowing freely now. "Eleanor made me promise something before she died, something about Daniel. She knew he'd struggle with her death, knew he'd blame himself for not being there more. She made me promise to tell him she left everything to charity in her will, make him think she didn't want him to have her money. She thought it would be easier for him, less guilt about accepting it." Sarah's pen stilled. "But that wasn't true?" "No," Thomas choked out. "She left everything to him, every penny. I put it in a trust, let it grow. 20 years of compound interest. It's worth nearly £500,000 now. But when I told him about the charity, he exploded. Said I'd poisoned her against him, stolen his inheritance. We said things, terrible things, and I was too proud to tell him the truth, too afraid it would seem like I was lying to win him back." The weight of this secret settled over the room like fog. Sarah continued writing as Thomas dictated, his words flowing now like water through a broken dam. He spoke of Daniel's childhood, of building tree houses together, of the way Eleanor's laugh could fill their small Manchester home with light. He spoke of his own father, a coal miner who died young, and how he'd sworn his own son would never know that kind of loss, only to create a different kind entirely. "I want him to know," Thomas said, gripping Sarah's hand as she wrote, "that every house I built after Eleanor died, I imagined him living in it. Every chair I crafted, I pictured him sitting in it. My hands kept working, but my heart stopped the day he walked away." Sarah wrote until her hand cramped, capturing 20 years of regret in carefully curved letters. When they finished, Thomas asked her to read it back. His eyes closed as he listened, occasionally nodding or asking for a word to be changed. "It's good," he finally said. "It's true. But will it be enough?" Before Sarah could answer, the monitors began their urgent song. Thomas's breathing became erratic, his face contorting with pain. Sarah called for the doctor, administered medication, performed the familiar dance of emergency care, but she could see it in his eyes, the fear that time was stealing his last chance. "The letter," he gasped between labored breaths. "Put the new one in my pocket, please." Sarah folded the pages carefully, slipped them into an envelope she found in his bedside drawer, and tucked it into his jacket pocket. Thomas's hand found hers one more time. "Find him," he whispered. "Promise me you'll find him." Dr. Harrison arrived, adjusting medications, speaking in the low tones reserved for endings. Sarah held Thomas's hand as he drifted into unconsciousness, his breathing settling into an ominous rhythm. She stayed past her shift, watching the rise and fall of his chest, the jacket hanging on its chair like a guardian of secrets. Margaret found her there at dawn. "Go home, Sarah, get some rest." But Sarah couldn't leave. Something held her there, something beyond professional duty. She thought of her own father, of words never said, of bridges burned by death rather than anger. At least Thomas and Daniel had the possibility of reconciliation, even if it seemed impossibly remote. Saturday arrived shrouded in unusual sunshine that felt almost offensive against the gravity of Ward 7. Sarah had been home for exactly 6 hours, but sleep had eluded her. She'd spent the time staring at her father's photograph on her nightstand, a man frozen forever at 35, younger than she was now. She'd tried to write him a letter once, years ago, but where do you send words meant for the dead? When she returned for her evening shift, she knew immediately. The way Margaret met her at the nurse's station, the subtle shift in the ward's atmosphere. Death had its own frequency, and those who worked with it could feel its approach like birds sensing a storm. "He's been asking for you," Margaret said softly. "He won't let anyone else near that jacket." Thomas was barely recognizable, his face gaunt, his breathing a shallow rattle that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his lungs. But his eyes, when they found Sarah, still held that Yorkshire determination. "You came back," he whispered. "I promised, didn't I?" Sarah took her familiar position beside his bed, noting how his hand still guarded that pocket even as his strength failed. "My Eleanor," Thomas began, his voice like autumn leaves scraping concrete. "She used to say that love isn't measured in words spoken, but in words saved." Never understood what she meant until now. He attempted a smile that broke Sarah's heart. 20 years of saved words in that pocket. Enough love to fill an ocean, but no boat to carry it across. Sarah pulled the curtains around his bed, creating a private world for what she knew were his final hours. She'd witnessed hundreds of deaths, but something about Thomas's impending departure felt personal, like losing her father all over again. "Tell me about Daniel as a boy," she said, hoping to give him comfort in memories. Thomas's eyes lit up despite his pain. "Brilliant boy, curious about everything. Used to follow me to construction sites, tiny hard hat bouncing on his head. Asked so many questions I'd run out of answers. 'Why do we build houses, Dad?' he'd ask. And I'd tell him, 'So families have somewhere to keep their love safe.'" He coughed, specks of blood appearing on his lips. Sarah gently wiped them away. "The day Eleanor died," Thomas continued, struggling now with each word. "Daniel held her hand and told her he'd take care of me. 17 years old, and he was ready to be the man of the house. But I pushed him away. Couldn't bear to see her eyes in his face, her kindness in his gestures. I thought I was being strong, but I was just being selfish." The sun began its descent, painting the hospital room in shades of amber and gold. Thomas's breathing became more erratic, the spaces between breaths growing longer. Sarah knew these signs, knew they were measuring time in minutes now, not hours. "Sarah," Thomas grabbed her wrist with surprising strength. "I need to tell you something else, about the letter. There's more than just words in that pocket." Sarah leaned closer, feeling his breath against her ear as he whispered his final secret. What he told her made her gasp, understanding finally why he'd guarded that pocket so fiercely. "It's all there," he said. "Everything he needs to know. But I'm scared, Sarah. What if he doesn't come? What if he throws it away unread? What if my words aren't enough to bridge 20 years of silence?" Sarah took his face gently in her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. "Love is always enough, Thomas. Maybe not to fix everything, but enough to start. Your son deserves to know his father's heart, even if he chooses not to accept it. That's not your burden to carry anymore." Thomas nodded, tears streaming down his cheeks. "Will you stay? I don't want to go alone." "You're not alone," Sarah promised, pulling her chair closer. "Tell me more about Eleanor. Tell me about your wedding day." As Thomas spoke in halting phrases about a church in Yorkshire, about Eleanor's dress that she'd sewn herself, about rain that turned to sunshine just as they said their vows, Sarah held his hand and felt the walls she'd built around her own heart beginning to crack. His words grew softer, more spaced out, like a radio station slowly going out of range. "Daniel," he suddenly said clearly, his eyes focusing on something beyond the room. "My boy. Tell him his mother and I are waiting. Tell him we never left, not really. We've been in every sunrise he's watched, every moment of joy he's felt. Love doesn't die, it just changes form." The monitor's steady beep began to stutter. Sarah squeezed his hand tighter, her professional composure finally breaking. "It's okay, Thomas," she whispered through her tears. "You can let go. I'll make sure Daniel knows. I promise you, he'll know everything. Thomas's eyes found hers one last time, and in them she saw gratitude, peace, and something else. A commission, a passing of responsibility from one broken heart to another. "The pocket," he breathed, so soft she almost missed it. "Don't forget." The monitor sang its long, final note. Sarah reached over and silenced it, then sat in the profound quiet that follows a last breath. She didn't call for the doctor immediately, didn't begin the procedures that death demanded. Instead, she sat with Thomas Whitmore, honoring the weight of his life, the pain of his regrets, and the love that had survived it all. The protocol after a patient's death was clear, clinical, practiced, but Sarah's hands trembled as she reached for Thomas's jacket, feeling like a trespasser in sacred territory. Margaret stood beside her as witness. Hospital policy when dealing with a deceased patient's belongings. "You don't have to do this now," Margaret said gently. "We can wait for the family." "There is no family coming," Sarah replied, carefully lifting the jacket from its chair. "Just a son who doesn't know his father is gone." The pocket felt heavier than it should, weighted with more than paper. Sarah's fingers found the envelope first, the one she'd helped Thomas write just days before. But beneath it was another envelope, older, yellowed with age, and something else, something small and hard wrapped in cloth. She pulled out the second envelope first. Written across it in faded ink were the words, "For Daniel, on your wedding day. Love, Mum." The seal had never been broken. "Oh, Thomas," Margaret breathed, understanding immediately. "He kept her letter all these years." Sarah unwrapped the cloth bundle, revealing a pocket watch. Antique gold, beautifully engraved with intertwining roses and the initials E&T on one side, Forever on the other. Inside, the mechanism had stopped at 317, and tucked behind the watch face was a tiny photograph. A young couple on their wedding day, radiant with possibility. But it was what she found next that made both nurses gasp. Folded into a small square was a bank document, a trust account statement showing Daniel Whitmore as the sole beneficiary. Current value $487,000. Paperclipped to it was a business card for a solicitor with a sticky note. All arranged, just needs his signature. "He really did save it all for him," Margaret whispered. 20 years of compound interest on his wife's inheritance. Sarah sank into the visitor's chair, overwhelmed by the weight of Thomas's secret sacrifice. He'd lived modestly, almost poorly, in a council flat, wearing the same 3 jumpers in rotation, all while sitting on nearly £500,000 that belonged to his son. "We have to find Daniel," Sarah said with sudden urgency. "He needs to know, not just about the money, but about all of it, the love behind it." Margaret looked skeptical. "Sarah, that's not our job. We notify next of kin of the death, return the belongings, and that's it. We don't get involved in family drama." But Sarah was already pulling out her phone, looking at the contact information in Thomas's file. He died thinking his son hated him, Margaret. And Daniel is living thinking his father betrayed his mother's wishes. "How can I know the truth and not act on it?" "Because it's not your pain to fix," Margaret said firmly but not unkindly. "Sarah, I know you see yourself in this situation, but you can't save your father by saving Thomas." The words stung because they were true. Sarah clutched her pendant, feeling 12 years old again, standing at her father's bedside as machines breathed for him after the car accident, unable to say goodbye because he was already gone. "Maybe not," Sarah admitted, "but I can't let another child live with regret that could be prevented. I know what it's like to carry questions that will never be answered. Daniel doesn't have to live with that. Not when the answers are right here." She dialed the number before she could lose her nerve. It rang once, twice, 3 times. Just as she was about to hang up, a voice answered. Tired, professional, clipped. "Daniel Whitmore." Sarah's throat constricted. She could hear Thomas in the timbre of his voice, Eleanor in the way he said his own name. "Mr. Whitmore, this is Sarah Mitchell from St. Mary's Hospital in Manchester. I'm calling about your father, Thomas Whitmore." A long pause. When Daniel spoke again, his voice was harder. "I don't have a father. Mr. Whitmore, please. I was his nurse. He passed away an hour ago. He asked me to call you." Another pause, longer this time. Sarah could hear breathing, unsteady and sharp. "He's really gone?" Daniel's voice cracked slightly on the last word. "Yes, I'm so sorry. He spoke of you often in his final days. He wanted you to know." "I don't want to know anything," Daniel interrupted. but his voice betrayed him, thick with unshed tears. He made his choice 20 years ago. He chose pride over family, chose to honor my mother's cruel wishes over supporting his son. Sarah gripped the phone tighter. Mr. Whitmore, what if I told you that wasn't true? What if I told you your father had something he'd been trying to tell you for 20 years? Then I'd say it's 20 years too late. But he didn't hang up. He left you a letter, Sarah continued quickly, and some other things. Items from your mother, things that will change everything you believe about what happened. I know you're angry. You have every right to be. But please, don't let him be cremated thinking you hated him. Come see him. Read what he wrote. If you still feel the same way after, at least you'll know you made an informed choice. The silence stretched so long Sarah thought he'd hung up. Finally, Daniel spoke, his voice barely audible. I can't. I live in London now. I have meetings, responsibilities. He waited 20 years. Sarah interrupted gently. I think your meetings can wait one day. She heard him breathing, struggling with decades of built-up walls. Was it peaceful? At the end? He was thinking of you, Sarah said truthfully. His last words were about you and your mother, about love changing form, but never dying. Daniel Whitmore stood at the entrance to St. Mary's Hospital at precisely 10 a.m. Monday morning, looking like a man approaching his own execution. Sarah recognized him immediately. He had Thomas's strong jaw and Eleanor's kind eyes, though both features were currently set in defensive rigidity. His expensive suit spoke of a life built far from Manchester's working-class roots. Mr. Whitmore, Sarah greeted him softly. Thank you for coming. He nodded stiffly, unable to speak. She could see the war playing out behind his eyes, grief battling anger, love fighting pride. Can I see him? Daniel finally asked, his voice smaller than expected. Of course, we've kept him in the family viewing room. Outside the viewing room, Daniel stopped, his hand frozen on the door handle. I don't know if I can do this. I've imagined this moment so many times, but I never imagined him silent. Sarah touched his shoulder gently. He's not silent, Daniel. His words are waiting for you. She handed him the 2 envelopes and the wrapped pocket watch. Daniel stared at his mother's handwriting, confused. This is Mum's writing. Why would he have… Read them, Sarah encouraged. I'll be right outside. Through the small window, Sarah watched him approach his father's body with halting steps. Daniel stood frozen, then suddenly collapsed into the chair, 20 years of suppressed grief pouring out in great heaving sobs. After an hour, she saw him open his mother's letter. His face cycled through confusion, shock, and wonder. Thomas's final words took longer, Daniel pausing frequently to wipe his eyes. When he emerged, Daniel looked transformed, older but lighter. He lied to protect me, he said hoarsely. All these years I thought he'd turned Mum against me, but she asked him to lie. She thought it would be easier for me. He held up the pocket watch. This was my grandfather's. I got married 5 years ago. Dad would have known. It was in the Manchester papers. He could have sent it then, but he didn't, Sarah said gently, because he was respecting what he thought were your wishes. Daniel pulled out his phone, showing her a photo of a small boy. My son, James Thomas Whitmore, 3 years old. I named him after Dad even while hating him. Tears flowed freely. Dad never knew he had a grandson. I robbed him of that. Sarah sat beside him. Your father knew about James. He had the birth announcement framed by his bedside. He was so proud, Daniel. Daniel looked at the trust document. Nearly £500,000. He lived in poverty while sitting on a fortune meant for me. What kind of man does that? The kind who loved his son more than his comfort, Sarah replied. Daniel stood with sudden clarity. I want to do something. A proper funeral. And something else. A program for people dying alone. The Thomas and Eleanor Whitmore Fund. The funeral took place on a rare sunny October day. The small church in Didsbury was fuller than expected. Colleagues from Thomas's construction days, nurses from the hospital, neighbors who remembered his kindness. Daniel spoke at the eulogy. My father built houses for 40 years. He used to say a good foundation could weather any storm. I spent 20 years thinking our foundation had cracked beyond repair. But I was wrong. The foundation of love and sacrifice. It was stronger than our silence. He held up the pocket watch. This stopped at 3:17, when my mother died. My father carried stop time for 20 years, just like our relationship. But love doesn't stop when time does. It waits. It endures. It forgives. After the service, Daniel found Sarah by Eleanor's grave. "You gave me back my father," he said. His wife Lisa approached with young James clutching a toy hammer. "This is James," Daniel introduced. "James, this is Sarah. She took care of Grandpa Tom." The boy looked up with solemn eyes. "Daddy says Grandpa built houses. I build towers." He held up his hammer proudly. Sarah knelt down. "Your grandpa would be so proud." That evening, Sarah went home and did something she hadn't done in 30 years. Wrote a letter to her father. She wrote about becoming a nurse, about lives saved and lost, about the loneliness of caring for others while carrying unhealed wounds. She sealed it in an envelope marked simply Dad. The next week, Daniel returned with a proposal. The Thomas and Eleanor Whitmore Fund would provide companionship for dying patients without families and support grief counseling. "I want you to run it," Daniel told Sarah. "You bridge the gap between the medical and the human." "I'm just a nurse," Sarah protested. "You saved my family," Daniel countered. "How many families could we save if we're 20 years early?" Sarah thought about Thomas's pocket, about letters never sent. "All right, but we do this properly, prevention, not just end-of-life intervention." That night, Sarah visited Thomas's grave. "You did it, Thomas," she whispered. "You brought your family back together. Your love did transcend death." The wind rustled through the cemetery trees, and for a moment she could have sworn she heard a Yorkshire accent saying, "I love." Sometimes the longest way round is the shortest way home. 5 years had passed since Thomas's death. Sarah stood in the renovated Whitmore Center for Family Reconciliation, watching Daniel teach a workshop on reconciliation. James, now 8, sat in the front row, understanding the weight of his grandfather's story. "The last letter my father wrote," Daniel told the group, "was 20 years of love compressed into paragraphs. But we don't have to wait until we're dying. We can be living letters, walking examples of reconciliation." A young woman approached Sarah afterward. "My mother and I haven't spoken in 3 years. I'm pregnant now, and I don't want my child to grow up not knowing their grandmother." Sarah handed her a card for the Foundation's mediation service, thinking of Thomas's words. "Love doesn't die, it just changes form." Daniel found Sarah in Thomas's garden, a peaceful courtyard where families could meet. He showed her a video of James presenting about heroes. "My hero is my grandpa Tom. I never met him, but he taught me that love is stronger than mistakes." Sarah wiped her eyes. "He would be so proud, Daniel." "I'm giving James the pocket watch when he's older," Daniel said. "Still broken. Let him decide if he wants to fix it or keep it as a reminder that love transcends time." That evening, Margaret stopped Sarah. Room 314. Inside, an elderly man sat beside his dying daughter, surrounded by family. "We hadn't spoken in 10 years, he told Sarah. "But we heard about the Foundation. Pride seems so small when faced with forever." As Sarah left that night, she stopped at her father's grave for the first time in 30 years. She talked until the stars came out, about Thomas and Daniel, about bridges built and rebuilt. The next morning, she found Daniel and James building with blocks. "What are you building?" she asked. James looked up with those familiar Whitmore eyes. "A bridge. Daddy says bridges bring people together." Sarah watched them work, grandfather and grandson united through story, if not through time, and thought, this is the real letter Thomas left. Not words on paper, but love in action, healing every wound, proving that the most powerful message is the one that continues to be written long after the author is gone. The bridge Thomas couldn't cross in life had become a pathway for countless others. And in that transformation, both Thomas and Sarah had found proof that love never truly dies. It just waits patiently for someone brave enough to deliver its message. The end